Welcome to Games from Folk Tales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week we return, for a brief episode, from the life of Benvenuto Cellini. Cellini crosses the king's official mistress. Madame d'Etampes is mentioned several times in Cellini's stories, but I've cut all of them except this one out, because they're repetitious. Madame d'Etampes is Anne de Pesler de Hely, the Duchess of d'Etampes, and the chief mistress of King Francis I. She loathes Cellini because he isn't sufficiently humble in her presence. He's a misogynist, so he dislikes her just because she's a woman, but he also sees her as a sex worker, and though he pays sex workers himself, he thinks that puts her into a lower social class. The French in his stories don't agree. Her role as mistress in title was well understood in the court, as it had existed for generations. She was, however, particularly adept at it, and was essentially the leader of the king's informal council. After Francis I died, she was banished from court, and all of her possessions were seized because she'd annoyed the new king, Henry II, and also the new maîtresse en titre. That was Diane de Poitiers, who'd been on the other side of many court intrigues. Diane became Henry's mistress when she was 35 and he was 15. She favoured the Medici marriage. Her daughter was Queen Catherine de' Medici's chief lady-in-waiting, and the queen was effectively her begrudging puppet until the death of the king. He carried Diane's favour in a joust, not Catherine's, including the joust in which he was struck in the head with a lance that led to his death. Catherine wasn't as harsh to Diane as many other queens had been to their dead husbands' mistresses, and kept the mistress system going in a way. Some of the members of her flying squadron took up that role at her selection with the subsequent king. Now over to a LibriVox recording. Thank you to the LibriVox production team.
In the meantime I brought my silver Jupiter to completion, together with its gilded pedestal, which I placed upon a wooden plinth that only showed a very little. Upon the plinth I introduced 4 little round balls of hard wood, more than half hidden in their sockets, like the nut of a crossbow. They were so nicely arranged that a child could push the statue forward and backwards, or turn it round with ease. Having arranged it thus to my mind, I went with it to Fontainebleau, where the king was then residing. At that time, Bologna, of whom I have already said so much, had brought from Rome his statues, and had cast them very carefully in bronze. I knew nothing about this, partly because he kept his doings very dark, and also because Fontainebleau is 40 miles distant from Paris. On asking the king where he wanted me to set up my Jupiter, Madame d'Etampes, who happened to be present, told him there was no place more appropriate than his own handsome gallery. This was, as we should say in Tuscany, a loggia, or more exactly, a large lobby. It ought indeed to be called a lobby, because what we mean by loggia is open at one side. The hall was considerably longer than 100 paces, decorated and very rich with pictures from the hand of that Admiral Rosso, our Florentine master. Among the pictures were arranged a great variety of sculptured works, partly in the round and partly in bas-relief. The breadth was about 12 paces. Now Bologna had brought all his antiques into this gallery, wrought with great beauty in bronze. He had placed them in a handsome row upon their pedestals, and they were, as I have said, the choicest of the Roman antiquities. Into this same gallery I took my Jupiter, and when I saw that grand parade, so artfully planned, I said to myself, "This is like running the gauntlet. Now may God assist me." I placed the statue, and having arranged it as well as I was able, waited for the coming of the king. The Jupiter was raising his thunderbolt with the right hand in the act to hurl it. His left hand held the globe of the world. Among the flames of the thunderbolt I had very cleverly introduced a torch of white wax. Now Madame d'Etampes detained the king till nightfall, wishing to do one of 2 mischiefs, either to prevent his coming, or else to spoil the effect of my work by its being shown off after dark. But as God has promised to those who trust in him, it turned out exactly opposite to her calculations, for when night came I set fire to the torch, which, standing higher than the head of Jupiter, shed light from above, and showed the statue far better than by daytime. At length the king arrived. He was attended by his Madame d'Etampes, his son the Dauphin and the Dauphiness, together with the King of Navarre, his brother-in-law, Madame Marguerite, his daughter, and several other great lords, who had been instructed by Madame d'Etampes to speak against me. When the king appeared, I made my prentice Ascanio push the Jupiter towards his majesty. As it moved smoothly forwards, my cunning in its turn was amply rewarded, for this gentle motion made the figure seem alive. The antiques were left in the background, and my work was the first to take the eye with pleasure. The king exclaimed at once, "This is by far the finest thing that has ever been seen, and I, although I am an amateur and judge of art, could never have conceived the 100th part of its beauty." The lords, whose cue it was to speak against me, now seemed as though they could not praise my masterpiece enough. Madame d'Etampes said boldly, "One would think you had no eyes. Don't you see all those fine bronzes from the antique behind there? In those consists the real distinction of this art, and not in that modern trumpery." Then the king advanced, and the others with him. After casting a glance at the bronzes, which were not shown to advantage from the lights being below them, he exclaimed, "Whoever wanted to injure this man has done him a great service, for the comparison of these admirable statues demonstrates the immeasurable superiority of his work in beauty and in art. Benvenuto deserves to be made much of, for his performances do not merely rival, but surpass the antique." In reply to this, Madame d'Etampes observed that my Jupiter would not make anything like so fine a show by daylight. Besides, one had to consider that I had put a veil upon my statue to conceal its faults. I had indeed flung a gauze veil, with elegance and delicacy, over a portion of my statue, with the view of augmenting its majesty. This, when she had finished speaking, I lifted from beneath, uncovering the handsome genital members of the god, then tore the veil to pieces with vexation. She imagined I had disclosed those parts of the statue to insult her. The king noticed how angry she was, while I was trying to force some words out in my fury, so he wisely spoke in his own language precisely as follows: "Benvenuto, I forbid you to speak. Hold your tongue, and you shall have 1,000 times more wealth than you desire." Not being allowed to speak, I writhed my body in a rage. This made her grumble with redoubled spite, and the king departed sooner than he would otherwise have done, calling aloud, however, to encourage me, "I have brought from Italy the greatest man who ever lived, endowed with all the talents."
Your saga may vary.